Welcome to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Osler. My guest on today's podcast is Lisa Hansen. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi, Richard.
Lisa is our first guest we've had twice. Lisa was on episode 26, and we had so much positive feedback that I had Lisa come back for this podcast to talk about transgender and have a podcast focused completely on this topic. Lisa is an active Mormon. She's an LGBTQ therapist that perhaps has done 3,000 to 4,000 LGBTQ therapy sessions. She's a PhD and a licensed marriage and family therapist. So I love this combination you have, Lisa, of being an active LDS member and also the clinical expertise you have in this space. So thank you for joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
Let's just talk about transgender. I'm thinking a lot of people listening to this podcast today may be listening for the first time to learn about transgender. It may be a parent, it may be a local leader that has a transgender person in their congregation, or just one of our listeners that wants to understand. So this is kind of basic, I'm thinking, as we start. Help us understand what being transgender is.
Yes. Well, it starts with what gender is. And we understand gender to be different from maybe what we'd say a person's sex identity is. Gender is related to that, but a little different. We generally identify sex when a baby is born by what we see. And we don't do much more in-depth work than that. We say, I see this anatomy, I see that anatomy, and I'm going to identify this. And that's often done in the first couple of seconds. If it's not done long before with an ultrasound, identifying body parts that say it's likely this child, this baby sex or another. And after a baby is born and begins to act in certain ways or be socialized in certain ways, we identify gender, which is more socially constructed. We say a baby acts like a boy or acts like a girl or acts like a tomboy or acts more feminine than we expect perhaps from a boy. And these are comments about gender. This is what is internally felt or externally expressed. And it may or may not have to do with body parts, and it may or may not have to do with DNA or chromosomes. It may not have to do with internal, what's going on inside a person physiologically. It has to do with what a person's internal experience is and how they express that. And when there is a match between what people expect from that child and what that child is expressing and feeling, we call this cisgender, C-I-S gender. It's a match. And when there seems to be not a match between what people expect from that child and how they behave and how they feel, we say that there's gender nonconformity. And for most children who experience gender nonconformity, that resolves by the time they hit puberty. And for some, there becomes a distress about the mismatch. And we call that gender dysphoria, which may be simple. We don't call it simple gender dysphoria, but we differentiate that from what we call a gender dysphoria disorder, which is not truly a disorder, but is an evidence of distress. And when a person experiences significant distress well into their teen years, we're more likely to say there's something going on there. And if the person experiences that in a significant way, they may actually identify as transgender. That is, their experience of gender transfers or extends, makes a transition away from what they feel is their gender assigned at birth. So it becomes a transitional experience in their minds. Even if they take no efforts to make any changes, they may feel that they are a transgender individual. That's maybe a beginning with a lot of terminology thrown in.
That's helpful. I know when I started to meet with transgender people and listen to their story, it really stretched me, Lisa, because I had never considered that someone's gender assigned at birth, their biological gender, could be different than how they felt inside. And it was very interesting to me. Some people were kind of blunt and said, well, my gender, how I feel, is how I feel between my ears, not what the biology is that we see at birth. And it's really stretched me. Is I don't think I could have learned much talking to cisgender people about transgender people. I certainly needed to start to talk to transgender people to hear their experience for me to get insight into this unique road. Yeah, continue with any thoughts.
Nothing makes as big a difference as hearing the experience of people who are experiencing it. It's really hard to extrapolate if there's a match to imagine what it would feel like for there to be a mismatch. And too often we as people who are cisgender talk, and we find it difficult to imagine. And so we think there must be some piece missing. There must just be, they must not really want to be what they were assigned at birth. They must not really want to be a girl. This person must have had a bad experience about women, and so they just want to be a guy. Or this person may feel like they can't really be a full-fledged member of the male segment of society. So they're settling, or they're trying to be female, or they're trying to get attention, or come up with some psychological reason that really has very little to do with that person's real experience.
And I want to talk more about that. One of the things that was helpful for me in my journey was to sort of understand intersex. Will you explain what an intersex baby is for our listeners? And that's different, obviously, than being transgender, but sort of having both genitalia present at birth.
Yes, and understanding intersex really does help to understand some of the experiences of transgender people. About 12 babies in every 1,000 are born with what we call ambiguous genitalia. That is, the doctor looks at the baby and says, oh, we need to do some kind of surgery for this baby to be fully male or female. There is a movement in the world that says, why do we need to do anything if it's possible for that baby to move forward without surgery? If there isn't a health reason, there may not be a reason to do something aesthetic to make them fit a particular sex or gender. But at this point, the way our culture handles these 12 babies in every 1,000 is to do some kind of surgery to make them more female or more male. And what we find with some of these babies is that their ambiguous genitalia comes from actually not having a match between their bodies and their chromosomal identity. And a person who has an XY chromosomal identity may actually have a uterus, or a person with XX may actually have fully formed testes, or maybe not fully formed, but some may have had enough testosterone in the womb that there is the formation of some male organs. So these babies, 12 in every 1,000, have something that needs to be surgically corrected if they are going to be anatomically what we think of as either male or female. And there are a smaller number than that who live their whole lives with characteristics anatomically of both male and female in their bodies.
That's very fascinating. I love the science to give us context on what's going on here, and certainly the science you just laid out is very factual. And then I lay in our our theology that we are spirits in the pre-earth life in either male or female. So I sometimes link what you talk about and think that intersex child has a female spirit or a male spirit in there. I don't know that for sure. I would assume that from everything I've been taught, and that we could sort of manufacture a transgender person if we do the surgery in the wrong direction. Any thoughts on that as you kind of tie in our theology with the science on that issue?
Well, we do have some cases in medical history of babies who were assigned a birth having been born somewhat intersex, or having had, let's start with that. And so a doctor made a decision about what was the easiest surgery to create, and that child was sent home, and the parents given that child to be raised. And the child itself said, look, I am not this gender that I've been assigned. This does not fit for me. And on going back, they discovered that the child's chromosome matched what they felt they were, that there was an internal gender before puberty hit, long before puberty hit, that child felt and experienced that was not what the parents were raising it as. And so we understand that there is internal gender that has nothing to do with socialization or how a child's being raised.
That's really fascinating, the word internal gender. It's certainly, when I considered that, Lisa, it sort of opened the box to me to a little bit that there's a lot I don't know here. And if people that aren't intersex feel transgender, then certainly the intersex transgender crossroads starts to connect with me. But then more things become possible to me. And my desire to put everything back in this nice, tidy box, that everything's lined up, sort of, I let go of that a little bit, and I'm willing to listen to people's stories. Any more thoughts on that?
Yes, the people that the transgender people that I've had occasion to talk with, who accept that they have an eternal spirit, almost universally identify with that eternal spirit as being what is constant about them, and that this body that they're in is the trial. It is the physical, mortal trial that is different from who their eternal spirit is.
And how do you reconcile that from a theology standpoint, that God would allow potentially female spirit to go into a male biological body?
Well, I don't think we know all of the ways in which we are tested and tried, and how we're going to learn things by our own experience. We certainly know that really strong, vibrant spirits can spend decades in a body that doesn't allow them to express even a fraction of who they are. We know that that is somehow part of God's plan. We know that being limited or inviting us to use different parts of ourselves than we think even exist is an important part of God's plan. We expect that our God, as we understand God and Christ, have to understand all gendered experiences in order to be who they are. The mechanism by which all of that occurs as we become more and more like them, we don't know how that occurs, but we know that God does give us experiences that enable us to make strides. And this may be part of that experience. It certainly is for those 1 or 2 in 1,000 births who are not born with a body that is going to meet their eternal needs in that way.
Yeah.
And we understand that all bodies are going to be changed in some kind of resurrection. So it shouldn't surprise us that bodies don't match our spirits.
Yeah. I certainly feel very consistent with you. I love the scripture Nephi, for he that diligently seeketh, the mysteries of God are given. I'm paraphrasing Lisa. And as I've diligently sort of sought on the transgender issue I think diligently seeketh means meeting with transgender people or hearing their stories and then taking that sort of in prayer to understand if there's some additional knowledge that can be revealed to us personally so that we can understand more of God's plan. Now, that certainly has stretched me out of this nice Mormon every box that I, as a deeply believing Mormon, I still believe in, but it's stretched me to try to understand God's eternal purposes, and that I only understand part of what's going on here, and I need to be teachable and humble enough to continue to learn. Let's
Yeah.
will you go through some old terms? Because when I connect, and go ahead and chime in on this, and then if you'll then transition into just old terms that I certainly could say out loud that I didn't realize were kind of old terms. So help us on vocabulary as well as any other thoughts.
You bet. I wanted to say that it seems like in all dispensations of time, and I may have said this before, but of the church as it is revealed, God's people as they are revealed, do have to have these kinds of learning experiences where there are groups of people that are on the outside that we don't understand how they relate to God's plan. And we have to make progress as people to understand how to be inclusive almost before the revelation comes that helps us understand what it is that's occurring. So it's something that our hearts have to be ready for before the revelation comes. Just wanted to add that in.
Boy, and you take me right to Christ's teachings in the New Testament, Lisa. When I think of the pool of Bethesda, I look at that painting with, I think it's a Karl Bloch painting with Christ being with the people at the pool of Bethesda. Now, they were outcasts not because they did anything wrong. They were just outcasts because they were different. And he was there and was with them and helping society understand who they were, and they were worthy and they were good. But how society saw many of the people in Christ's day that Christ went to seems to be a type or an example for us in our day. We've moved on from some of the people in Christ's day that we would have said were unworthy. We now understand they are worthy, and we understand the science behind what was going on in their lives, that society said they weren't clean or worthy of our presence, but now we're tested in other ways. So I think, to your point, there are parallels between Christ, the people in Christ's day, and the people in our day, and an example of how we should respond.
Yes, and they've always been what they would look at, what the God's people would look at as non-conforming people. There were people who didn't conform to what they understood God's people would be like. And in every stage, there were real reasons these people were not conforming to what God's people should be like. They weren't made up. They were sometimes given by revelation that these people were non-conforming. But God always seems to want us to be able to transcend that, to actually hear from people what their experience is like, and to open our hearts to them.
Yeah, that's really good. Talk about old terms, Lisa, things that, just if we've got honest people, listeners trying to say, okay, what is the right vocabulary? I want to actually be educated on vocabulary. Walk us through some of that.
Well, as we know, gender characteristics and identities not stereotypically associated with sex at birth is a common and culturally diverse human phenomenon, but it has not been accepted, or it's usually seen as a negative thing, and is only, I would say, in the last several decades in important circles being seen as a positive step forward for the individuals who are experiencing it, to acknowledge it and find a way to integrate that into their lives. And before that time, the only people who were studied were those who were actually changing their body characteristics through surgery. And because that was the only group that was studied medically, that group was known as transsexual. Now, because we understand that experience is much broader, this experience of gender nonconformity or transgender, we have discontinued the use of the term transsexual because it maintains the old connotation of other or outside or beyond normal accepted experience. And people who have these experiences are claiming terms that situate them where they feel they belong, which is not outside, but is either as gender nonconforming or, as some would say, gender non-binary. I'm not choosing to identify as either male or female because I embrace the characteristics in my body and in my heart and mind that are both. Or as transgender, that is identifying as a gender different from the one the parents would have assumed at birth. Or as, it seems like there's a term I'm not remembering, but
I remember
those are the terms that people generally identify with now.
Yeah, I remember
transsexual.
I remember transvestite too as a term. Tell us about that term.
Yes, and transvestite referred to people who wore clothing associated with the gender that people assumed they weren't. So if you saw a man wearing woman's clothes, generally you would say that's a transvestite. Women who wore men's clothes were not so clearly defined that way because it seems to be more normal in our society for women to wear men's clothing. For a woman to go to a formal party dressed as a man 20 or 30 years ago might have been referred to as transvestite, crossing the boundaries of clothing. These days, it's much more accepted for people to wear clothing of any type and more normal for people to wear ambiguous gendered clothing, that is, clothing that could belong to either men or women. And so the term transvestite also seems to be an othering term, a term that makes people feel like they're outside of normal cultural boundaries. We might say someone is a cross-dresser if they are truly trying to dress differently from how you might expect. But generally, we say they dress in a gender non-conforming way, which is right now a term that seems to be most inclusive.
So it sounds like the word trans and transgender are appropriate words today to use, and those other words you talked about are not appropriate. Is that correct?
Yes, and you identify trans as being an appropriate term, and generally it is. It's always good to find out what the person themselves chooses as how they identify, because a person who identifies as just gender non-binary might not want to be known as trans. A person who identifies as transgender generally would be okay being known as trans. But it's always nice to ask because terminology is still evolving. That's the way of language.
Yeah, I think that's a great principle, is everybody gets to choose their own label. And it's our job to ask people individually what names they'd like to be used, what labels. That doesn't seem like it's crossing a line in any doctrine or any thing that I'm aware of. It's just part of respect, understanding, and love is to ask people what they'd like to be called. Thoughts on how important it is for our trans friends to be named how they'd like to be named?
Yes. That is one of the naming and referring to people as they see themselves is one of the most important factors in mental health. People who identify as a particular name and a particular set of pronouns, and people around them have a hard time doing that, or they don't think it's right to do that, or they just find it difficult, or they excuse themselves from it, actually are contributing to negative mental health, depression, anxiety, and social difficulties. It's actually a pretty arrogant thing for any one of us to do, to say, I know your name and who you are better than you do yourself. It's actually diminishing. of another person's human dignity. It's really hard for any of us who know someone in a particular way and for a particular amount of time, especially in our families, to suddenly, it feels to us, make a switch to a new name and a new set of pronouns. And of course, it will be difficult. But for us to excuse ourselves or say, well, you look like, or you haven't changed, or any excuse like that is actually very demeaning. It's important to people to be able to interact and to have an identity that conveys who they really are. If any of us who might be cisgender can imagine what it would be like to put on a different persona that is not us, and then try to interact in the world on an ongoing, day after day, permanent basis, we can begin to get a taste of what it might be like to be assumed to be someone different from who we are. And that's what our transgender friends, neighbors go through as they live their lives. They're used to that, and it does diminish them. We can measure the diminishment that takes place.
That's powerful, Lisa. That's really powerful. I think some people say, well, let's say I'm going to make up a case situation here. John is transitioning to Mary, and so he's going male to female, and so she is now Mary. I mean, refer to Mary as her and she and Mary. But I find some people won't call Mary Mary until she's sort of past. She looks like female and she dresses like female. So talk about, I think I know the answer here, but it seems like some of us don't want to call Mary Mary until she passes to a degree that we're comfortable with, or a period of time has passed before we'll call Mary Mary.
Yes, and this, I believe, has to do with what we were like in ages 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, as a lot of our own cortex was formed in our brains that allowed us to perceive other people. And what it did at that time, as we got to know people, was we identified about them some of the first things we could identify about them, which was probably gender and race and age. And so as we started categorizing people in that way, that was how we came to settle as how we respond to people. And now, as we recognize that that isn't really helpful for some people, we have to retrain our minds not to respond in terms of race, gender, and age in some ways because it isn't helpful. And it's not an easy thing to do. Our kids are going to do a better job at it than we are because they will be exposed to greater diversity and a greater number of diverse experiences with people. So we can be patient with ourselves because it is hard, but it's really important that we don't say, because it's so hard for me, that must mean that that's how God intended, because that's just natural for me to look at you and see male. So I'm not going to be able to call you by Mary until you change and meet what seems natural to me to be female. That's just an indication of our own liability, and it's important that we own it. This is how I grew up, we can say inside of our hearts. This is how my brain was wired. And now I have the opportunity to be of service and be of help to other people in making room for them to come into my life rather than me insisting that they meet what makes my brain happy.
That's very helpful. One of the phrases I've adopted along this journey is, it costs me nothing to call Mary Mary. And it means everything to Mary to do that. So it seems like there's Christ-like principles that would want me to call Mary Mary in this process. I
so agree that it is Christ-like to call Mary Mary. I see people who feel a great cost in it, and I don't want to discount that cost because it hurts some people emotionally and spiritually because it's a journey. But it is a great service, and I believe it is Christ-like to do that as well, Richard.
As I work with so many parents, and you obviously have been doing this for a long time, parents of transgender children, it is a real journey, and I have tremendous empathy for them as their son, John, is now identifying as Mary, to keep that example going forward. And it seems to be stages that they go through to sort of understand this. One of the things sometimes I hear, though, is that they're thinking this is just a phase that their child will go through and come back on the other side as cisgender. And so they're cautious about doing anything that sort of validates their feelings of being transgender, because their hope or their belief is that this is a temporary phase that they're going through, like people go through phases, I guess, and they will end up out of this phase and be back in a cisgender world. How do you help parents particularly manage that?
Well, the reason that it is so common for parents to feel this way is because their children do go through so many phases. And gendered phases do occur. Most gender nonconforming children will identify as cisgender by the time they're in their 20s without having identified as transgender. What trips parents up sometimes are when their children actually begin to say, I am different in my mind than I am in my body. And I would like you, Mom and Dad, to understand this about me. And then when a parent says, I think this is a phase, what a parent is actually doing at that point is invalidating a child and actually harming their relationship. Because by the time a child says something like that to parents, they have thought this through for years. Even if this child is a really impulsive child and decides to do this one day and then do that one day and then invest in that and then totally leave it behind and try something else, and the parent knows this is an impulsive child. If a child says, I am different in my mind than I am in my body, this child has thought about this for years without sharing it yet with the parents. And a parent would do well to say, I will be a listener here. And in their heart, they can say, even if this changes in the next 5 minutes, 5 years, 50 years, even if this ever changes, my relationship with my child is the most important thing that can happen here. And if I claim that I know my child better than they know themselves, I will set myself at a distance from my child. And I will no longer be the person they turn to talk to about what's happening to them. So in this moment, a parent might say, I will choose to develop my relationship with my child rather than be the all-knowing parent. And in that moment, they can then say, tell me about yourself and tell me about your identity. We have absolutely no studies that show that something terrible happens to children when parents call them by a different name and different pronouns, even if it changes 3 or 4 times in the next 6 months. Nothing that shows that that's harmful to children. And abundant evidence that it helps children's mental health to be able to say to their parent, this is what I'm experiencing, this is what my identity is, and have a parent say, that matters to me.
That's very helpful. I think at the beginning of that section you said a lot of children do feel some gender nonconformity, and that passes and they become cisgender. But I think if I understood what you said, if a child gets to the point where they're asking a parent or a loved one to call them by different names and use different pronouns, that's different. And that's something that they have been working on.
I wish that's how most children started, and it's not.
And so if a
Most
child's...
children start... Go ahead. You were going to ask me something.
Well, it sounds like if they get to the point where they're wanting a parent or a loved one to use different names or different pronouns, that's different than some of the gender nonconformity that perhaps a greater percent of the population experience. This is a big deal to get to this point and should be taken authentically.
Yes.
Sometimes I hear
children
these...
are notoriously reluctant to tell parents that they are a different gender or that they feel a different gender. Most children are keenly aware that their parents are invested in a particular gender identity for them, buying clothes, setting them up with activities, wanting to guide them toward this or that. Parents may not even be conscious of how invested a parent is in a particular gender. But children are way more aware of that, and they don't want to disappoint their parents. So a child might wear dresses for a period of time and then suddenly refuse to wear a dress. Absolutely refuse, but not say, because I feel like a boy. They might not say that. They just will refuse to wear a dress. Or mom will buy a scooter with a unicorn on it, and the child will refuse to get on it, and the parent won't understand.
That's very
These
helpful.
are gender nonconforming behaviors that may or may not indicate some kind of distress. When this continues toward puberty, then a parent can say, I wonder if the first signs of puberty are causing additional distress for my child. And that's a good time to open the conversation and say, I'm wondering, and of course, in the car is a good time to have a conversation because you're not looking at each other. And a parent can say, I'm wondering if becoming more of a woman is going to bug you. And just see what the child says.
That's a great question, Lisa. It's kind of a scary question for a parent to ask, but I think it creates a foundation of communication that would be very helpful. One of the questions I get a lot, and I know you get these more than I do, since you do this professionally full time, is this narrative that society is getting liberal and more secular, and Satan, these are the last days, and he has a greater hold on the human population, and so this is part of that. And in a liberal secular world where people are more exposed to this kind of stuff, that it's just part of the society going in the wrong direction, and some of our youth get caught up in that. And even maybe that didn't seem like we had transgender people, 1 or 2 or 3 generations ago. So I hear that a lot. Walk our listeners through your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that same sentiment has been expressed through the last several thousand years. Every time there was something that was out of the cultural comfort zone that families were experiencing, whether it was including people with disabilities whose culture was different, whether it was including certain kinds of music or movies or some kind of culture that we now say, oh, that has, as long as we make wise choices, those things actually can enrich a person's life. I think even Peter felt that to some extent before he received the vision of what was clean and unclean, was that the influx of Gentiles into the church was bringing on the last days, which they felt was imminent at that time. I think it's a real phenomenon inside of ourselves to say, wait, this is too far to go. This is not what God wants. I think that is something that really does happen inside of us. I think the thing that makes a difference is to actually hear and see God in the people that were once different and other. To hear and see, to see and feel God in their stories, and to recognize that God is speaking to us through them, not in spite of them, not around them, but through them to us about life and encouraging us to expand our life view. And that this is actually moving us toward the love and beauty of the second coming rather than toward the destruction that we anticipate God will want to wreak on the world at some point. This is actually calling us to more Christ-like behaviors with people.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I have a thing on my Facebook of a woman who ran a marathon 50 years ago, the Boston Marathon, and the race officials are running after her, pulling off her number. And because the society at the time felt women couldn't run marathons, and I was kind of stunned to learn that, Lisa. And then 50 years later, this same woman, as a celebrated participant, ran the Boston Marathon with the same number. And it just struck me that, what would I have made the same mistake in that day in my assumptions about women? And I'm sure I would have unless maybe I'd met this female runner and firsthand learned that she could actually run marathons. With her coach, she had run a 30-mile training run, which is obviously longer than the marathon. So I think if I had listened to her experience, I would have been thoughtful enough to say, of course she can run the Boston Marathon. We shouldn't rip her number off. But it was a good example for me of just, where sometimes we are in society, and in 50 years, I won't be alive in 50 years, Lisa. I'll be 107. But what I will look back in my day right now and say, well, what was I thinking? Or I would have never thought that. Maybe my grandkids will do that for me. But I think you illustrate a good, example there that perhaps this isn't the downfall of society and our society getting more secular and liberal, but perhaps it's us understanding the science. Certainly the science is teaching us that women can run marathons. That's been the accepted norm for 50 years. In fact, I've seen some of the research that the longer the distance, the better the women outperform men. But then I wonder what sort of scientific data will help us understand transgender. Are you aware of any scientific data that's helping us understand the science behind someone being transgender?
Yes, and I can talk about some of that in a moment. I want to just add in that at all of those stages, like at the time when the woman was pulled out of the marathon, and with people of different races not being allowed to participate, at all of those times, the people who did it felt like they were in the majority culture. These were not outliers. And there were religious reasons. These were not just bigoted, biased people that everybody knew were a little bit on the weird side. These were people who had mainstream religious views that said things like, this kind of behavior on this woman's part comes from a desire to be something different from what God intended. And we need to make sure she knows what God intended. And when the races mix, they're doing something different from what God intended. And so they should actually have different facilities, different swimming pools or whatever, because God intended it to be this way. These were all religious reasons that people gave for why we couldn't do this thing. And now we would never give a religious reason for why a woman shouldn't run in a marathon or for why we should have different swimming pools. That wouldn't even occur to us. And I anticipate at some future day, in the same way as, I'm going to give one more example. When autism was first being diagnosed, people assumed that there was some character reason that there was a problem with it. In the same way with schizophrenia, actually, that there was some problem in the family or there was some problem psychologically that needed to be corrected. And so the religious approach to these things was also, this person is not like they should be. And they need to make some changes in order for them to be included. And now we understand that there are actually physiological things that are behind all of this. And so we understand them differently. And we say, let's be as inclusive as we can. We no longer say there's a religious reason for excluding people. And I think that how we are with trans people, with transgender people, will likely have a similar trajectory. That is, we may first say, well, these people aren't being what God expects of them. These people need to make some changes in order for us to include them. And eventually we'll understand that the changes need to come from inside us, and how we respect and include them will be the change that happens inside us. I want to talk a little bit about what the medical world is teaching us about things that contribute to the experience of being trans. And I get this from Bill Bradshaw's work. He's got a pamphlet that's coming out shortly that will help us understand origins of gender identity and how transgender people physiologically may be different from cisgender people. Even there are parts of the brain that are actually different in transgender people than they are in cisgender people. And for people who identify as female, even though their bodies may have told people at birth that they were male, their brains seem to be, in many respects, more similar to female brains, and vice versa. The subcortical gray matter of the brain is masculized in transgender men. When I say transgender man, I mean someone who might have been known as female at birth and who now identifies as a man. And there are differences in brain structures of various different kinds that are more similar between transgender men and men than they are between the transgender men and females that may have had similar body parts at birth. A steroid hormone exposure before birth seems to play a part. People who identify as transgender may go back and find out that they actually did have hormone exposure that may have changed how they experience their brains. There's a number of studies that show differences in brain structures.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me, and certainly I love the history that you walk us through and where we are now. And if we can take that approach with transgender, that seems to be a thoughtful thing where it's probably better for me to not, I call it the trap of unearned opinions, Lisa, the idea that I probably shouldn't have opinions about things until it's easy to have opinions. I should probably not have opinions. And that gets harder to do as I get older until I
don't know of any way to truly have no opinion. And I think our lives are designed that way, to give us experience and help us feel like we know something more because of our experience. That seems natural.
Yeah.
But when we come up with someone who has a different experience from ours, I think the most Christ-like thing is to listen and to step back, to step down. And so often, because we feel like we understand what God's plan is, we can actually step right in the way of what it is God wants us to learn about that plan, which in every generation of time has been different from decade to decade. We've learned more about it.
And I'm reminded of a conference talk I listened to this morning on my walk about meekness and about that Christ-like attribute of being different than humility. I think meekness is the ability to learn, and to learn from people that may have less experience or less age, or seem to be in a station in life where we naturally wouldn't be meek and willing to learn from them. So it seems like something that we all need to do.
Yes, you're talking about David Bednar's, Elder Bednar's
Yes, talk. Exactly.
Yep.
Great talk.
And I underlined a number of things from his talk about that that should be helpful from us. He actually says, meekness is a particular spiritual receptivity to learning both from the Holy Ghost and from people who may seem less capable, experienced, or educated, who may not hold important positions or who otherwise may not appear to have much to contribute. And I think sometimes members of the church think of transgender people in that category as having somehow less spiritually to offer. And I will just say from my experience with them, they have much to offer. I see deep spirituality, great ability to receive others, to offer love, to expand themselves. To the extent that they are accepted, to the extent that what they have to offer is seen as positive, a contribution, to the extent that they are demeaned or diminished, or people say, I know who you are, or they excuse why they use the wrong name and pronouns, that diminishes that person's ability to communicate their Christ-like spirit to you.
Isn't it interesting that we're both very familiar with that same general conference talk in the context of this issue and in the context of understanding our fellow brothers and sisters better? That's fascinating. I'm thinking of the parable of the Good Samaritan right now, Lisa, and I think it's interesting the way that Christ set that up, but one of my conclusions is that parable is that teaches an individual or group who is disapproved of can exhibit superior moral behavior than those who disapproves of them in the first place. So I think it's the parable of the Good Samaritan is stretching us to look at people that are disapproved of, and that could be our transgender friends, and wonder what kind of moral behavior that they can exhibit that may be superior and that will help me be a better disciple of Christ if I engage and learn from my transgender friends.
Yes, they are, as in the parable of the Good Samaritan, exemplary. They are examples for us in many respects. But we won't know that or experience that unless we're open to it.
Talk about advice, and we've touched on this, but advice you give to parents or family members with a transgender family member.
Yes, and this brings up some of the ways in which gender dysphoria, or the distress about gender nonconformity, comes up in families. And it often comes up when a child who was otherwise doing well in school and socially suddenly seems to drop off the face of all of those aspects of doing well. That is, they start staying home from school. They start not being able to function. They may spend more time in their room. They refuse to participate with families. And although there are aspects of this that are a common teenage experience, for a lot of parents, this puzzles them completely because the relationship they had with their children was so positive and so much good happening, and then the child becomes non-functioning. And Nika Allgood's question, she's a mother of a trans man, a trans child. She, at the time, it was a child. She said, "Is what you're feeling here different from what you feel here?" And she pointed to the mind and to the body, and that enabled her child to say, "Yeah, there's something different going on there," and that helps. Although some children still do not find that they want to share anything. They really don't want to admit it, or they don't want to disappoint, or they don't want to become something that feels like there's no room for that kind of person in their family's life or in their own social life. So there may be a period of time where a child won't share, won't talk. There may be a time even after a child does say, "I don't want to be a boy anymore," or "I don't want to be a girl," or "I can't grow up this way," or something that lets you know that there's something going on, where a child still will not socialize. They will not come out and be with family. They will not come out and be with friends, because they have to forge an identity inside themselves. And this takes time. And I tell parents that in some ways it's like an egg in a nest. you want to see something happen. You want to crack it open and make it come out. You want to get something positive going because you can't imagine anything good is happening to this child. But something is happening that you can't see. It's inside and it is occurring. And you can give it space and you can keep it warm. You can keep it in a safe space while this happens and trust that something good is occurring.
That's beautiful. That is very, very helpful. And there's a good spirit here. Even though you're on the phone and I'm sitting in my front room, I hope our listeners can feel the spirit here guiding them. And I hope that impressions come into our listeners' minds that may not be things that either of us say, but just because the spirit of this discussion is so helpful that they will be guided, as I know a lot of parents are praying on how to navigate this road, that this podcast is helpful for that. Talk about bishops and Relief Society presidents, young women's leaders, young men's leaders. If there's a parent that has confided in them that they have a transgender child, or they may be aware of this directly without the parent's knowledge, or trying to create a environment in their ward that if there's a transgender and LGBTQ child, that they will feel comfortable opening up. That's kind of a long question, Lisa, but it comes back to just advice.
Very good question.
Advice for local leaders, because there's often a lot of tension between parents of transgender children and their local leaders.
Yes, there is, and this tends to be a fairly hot issue in church circles. I want to go back and say one more thing about parents, and that is, it's often very helpful if there is not flow of communication to have the family come to family counseling of some kind that is supporting and affirmative of the child's, whatever the child is claiming about what is happening to them. It's helpful to participate in counseling so that the child doesn't stay isolated, but starts to see that there is a future in whatever identity feels like the best pathway for them. So I would encourage mental health support for that family.
And I like that idea. And I'm just going to jump in here with an email I got this week. I'm not going to mention it's an active LDS mother of a transgender child. And I think it helps our listeners just kind of understand this journey for these parents. She writes, "It's such a mix of emotions. There's part of me that wants this journey to have a destination. Part of me wants to have this done right now and have my child return to being cisgender. Another part of me wants to start the medical transition right now. How do I guide my child through these decisions? What are the signs that I'm pushing too hard for one thing or another? Is it possible this is just a simple journey and it will have no destination? It's possible we'll always be questioning what things demonstrate that it's time to press hard and force the issue." So I think any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say as far as pressing an issue, that is probably never helpful, which doesn't mean that kids don't need help when they're feeling things that they can't articulate or that they don't know that it's safe to say themselves. And sometimes parents have to say, "Are you feeling this?" and being very specific about it. But be very careful not to press and say, "Well, if you're feeling this, it might be a good idea if you try to pass." Or do you want to, shall we, let's go to the doctor and get you some hormones. I don't think there's ever a point at which a parent should press the issue toward transition. But if a child says, I'm interested in hormones, or if a parent says, "Are you interested in hormones?" and the child says yes, then it's time for both the parent and the child to do some really open-ended research and finding out what's going on, not trying to press it, not trying to diminish it or say, let's for sure wait on this, but being open and seeing what's happening and getting some good advice from open medical personnel. I talked with a mother just this last week who said that her child she kept asking because the child was obviously identifying differently from the birth gender, and for months and months identified differently. And the mother kept saying, "Do you want us to call you by a different name?" And the child would always say, "Nope, nope, nope." And then one time when the mother was with the child in the car, or the child would say eventually, "Whatever you want," whatever you want, which is typical sometimes of children who don't want to disappoint parents. And it's hard for a parent to say, "Well, what I want to do is call you by a new name." That's not what a parent wants. So the conversation in this particular case went that the mother was riding with the child in the car and said, if I were you, I might be worried about going to a new school in the fall. And one of the things I might be worried about is, and the child said, "How to have everybody know my new name." The child finished the sentence. And then the mother could say, the mother said, "Well, I think we can support you at that. We can talk to the school and help them get to know your new identity, and you can start fresh. And would it be helpful if the family did the same thing?" And the child said yes. So there are ways to not push while opening up the conversation and giving the child the sense that it's safe to talk about this, and it's actually okay to bring this up, and it's okay to talk about this aspect of that or that aspect. A parent sometimes has to make room for that if the child's not doing that.
That's very thoughtful. And you taught on our last podcast you did with me and our listeners the principle of self-determination. And that is very helpful for me. I think I practiced that in my YSA assignment, where I would always, talk about the universal truths of our church and our doctrine, but at the end of the day, I practiced the principle of self-determination, that everybody got to choose their own path, and I would walk with them on that path and continue to walk with them and help them make thoughtful decisions on the path that they felt was right for them. And a few of the YSAs, that path was not, was outside of the doctrine of our church. Now, I don't want to compare that to being transgender, because being transgender, I don't want to infer is outside the doctrine of our church, but it is sort of stretches parents to know how to do this, because it complicates their path within Mormonism if they transition. But I do love this principle of self-determination, that our job is to ultimately help people make the best decisions for themselves and create principles and understanding and context and therapy that can be very helpful to help people make thoughtful decisions. Thoughts on that?
Yes, and to trust them to have a relationship with God that we don't have to monitor or manage, which is, nor do we have to inform them that we don't agree with it. I don't think there's no scripture that says, please make sure that people know that you disagree with their behavior or who they are. I don't know of any scripture like that. The thing that makes wards difficult is because we understand a ward to be a place where certain kinds of social life are lived out. And in many respects, that social life is highly gendered. People have different experiences at church based on the gender they identify as. And there are some wards that are actually very responsive to a family member's gender that the family is okay with. And so the child just moves in the circles of the gender they identify with. As the ward and family, you come to know that person, the more experience they have with the transgendered person, the more likely they are to provide the kinds of experiences that are congruent with that person's gender. And the less experience they have, the harder it might be. So we do find some conflict in wards that say you can only participate in these kinds of experiences because we identify you as this gender. It's helpful then for parents to talk with leaders that are sympathetic or who have some experience, and to create a network of those who are willing to have that child's back. Hopefully that will also be the bishop. But in some cases, bishops are very open to learning something new about how the family experiences this child or how the family and neighborhood experiences this child, and that they're willing to make the ward experiences match that. In those cases, we find less distress in the family and less having to sit outside the ward in order for that family to have social and mental health.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I think there's principles that can help people in this podcast, local leaders. I'm reading from this same woman that's kind of talking about her relationship with the bishop, and I like her words here. She says, how can I get our bishop to quit talking at us and start listening to us? He is a good man with a great heart.
Then I would use two quotes. The one that we gave just a few moments ago from Elder David Bednar's talk, Meek and Lowly of Heart. That's the most recent April conference. And also Elder M. Russell Ballard's devotional address at BYU that he gave recently, where he said how important it is to listen to our LGBTQ brothers and sisters and their families. He didn't say and their families, but in words, that's who we listen to when we're trying to find out about children, as we find out what their families' experiences. Even though I don't think bishops, most bishops wouldn't respond well to someone saying, here's what the general authorities say you're supposed to do. It certainly is possible for families to say, here's some quotes that we take to heart in our family, and we spend a lot of time listening to our family member, and we're hoping that this can happen in the ward too. And Bishop, we're asking your help in helping other people listen to us, and we would love to start with you.
Yeah, I really like that. We're kind of wrapping up, Lisa. I've got two other potential questions if you want to address. Any advice you have for trans people? We've talked, you may have hit that, or just any other points you'd like to make as we're wrapping up.
Yes. For trans, let's start with the youngest one. We do know of children who I very strongly identify as trans, and who want to know of other people who are like them. And this is what they tell their parents. Are there any other people like me who are different in their bodies and their minds, and who don't want to be who they are? Are there other people like me? And they are persistent in asking about this. So finding resources of other people that your children can be with is not going to make them more likely to be something they're not. It's actually going to make it more likely that they will be able to integrate what's really happening with them into their full lives. We tend to cling to things that we can't explore or that we can't find out what it really means. It may go deeper inside, but we hold on to it. It doesn't just dissipate. So, for example, a preteen tomboy girl is more likely to become fully herself if she's allowed to be somewhat tomboyish and explore that, rather than being deprived of it her whole life, when it may have more of a hold on parts of her identity that are hidden rather than being something she can integrate. So the advice for trans people is similar to that. Find others who have the same experiences and feelings that you do, so that you have a chance of exploring it without the same anxiety of, am I going to be judged for this? Am I going to be seen as less than because I'm experiencing this? And there are more abundant resources today than there were last week and the week before and the week before. The internet is full of healthy resources, as well as always some that we wouldn't choose. And families can explore those together and find safe places, Rainbow Mutual or certain groups that can get together where people can find out what they really feel, open up parts of themselves that have been hidden, and say, what is this that's happening to me? When I talk to trans young people, that's one of the things they want to do most, is have these kinds of discussions, find out what's really happening inside of them. Can what's happening to me really be part of a normal experience in this way or in that way? And so the social part of it is important for trans people of all ages.
That's very, very helpful. Any other closing thoughts, Lisa?
I do want to say one thing, and I don't know if you want to include this in your podcast or not, but when cisgender people learn about transgender people, their minds tend to go to transitioning. And they ask really awful questions like, have you had surgery? Which is not a part of a typical transgender person's experience or plans, and comes across as extremely intrusive and rude. Transgender people can have absolutely no plans to even try to pass as a gender different from the one they were born with, but simply identify as transgender. They may want to socially transition. That is, they may want to come across to everyone around them as male when they're actually female, when their body is female. I said that badly. And if I'd said that, I just want to apologize for that and move on. When their body has female parts, they may be male and want people to want to pass as male, and that may be the most transitioning they ever do. Or they may want to have a hormone treatment, which enables their body to and their minds to be more of the experience of what they identify. And I want to say that hormone treatment does sometimes resolve the dysphoria because it enables the mind to feel and experience more of what a typical female or male might experience. As transgender females, that is, they may have male body parts, have estrogen in their system, they start to experience themselves as having a wider range of emotions and being able to verbalize emotions. And that is something that we expect with estrogens in the system. And there are male experiences that are enhanced with testosterone in the system that are psychological, as well as body shaping or body changing. So many transgender people may have hormonal treatment, but may not elect to have surgery. So surgery is an option that is available now more than it has been before, and transgender people often do consider surgery. But these are personal experiences, and no one is entitled to know the anatomy that a person has. What we do have the privilege of asking is name and pronouns. And if you want to know something about someone, you can say, tell me your name, and you can say, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm interested in your pronouns. Those are the kinds of things that it is socially appropriate to bring into a conversation with someone that you want to get to know. And then if they want to share more of their experience with you, that can come later. But that's if you find out that someone's transgender, that's all that it's socially acceptable to ask.
Well, that's very, very helpful for our listeners. And I'm reading a prior Facebook post that kind of is sort of my journey to get to where you are. And I wrote here, I've learned not to wonder about gender-conforming surgery in my interaction with my transgender friends. I've trained my mind not to go there, but rather see my transgender friends as the outward gender they are expressing. I've learned not to ask this question and somehow link the surgery to the degree of transitioning. That is something for each transgender person to decide and not for me to access or process. So it just comes back to your point that I show respect, understanding, courtesy, and love by using the name that they would like to be called and the pronouns that reflect how they feel. And for me, that is part of my role as in humanity to honor somebody and is consistent with the doctrine of our church. Thank you, Lisa, for joining us. You have this wonderful expertise, your clinical expertise, but also your understanding and commitment to our beautiful restored church. And it's this wonderful intersection you breed and also the other things that you do as a mother of your own family and the other things you're doing. So thank you for joining us. Your first podcast was so helpful, and I had so many people reach out. So I thought as we started to talk about transgender, and we're going to invite some transgender people on the podcast in subsequent episodes to share their journey. But I thought of having you first, Lisa, to kind of lay this foundation for our listeners as now we move to hear individual stories. Any other thoughts or
I will look
comments?
forward to. I'll look forward to hearing that.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, our listeners, for joining us on another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.